May you have the hope that comes from placing tomorrow in his hands, the grace that comes from placing today in his hands, the healing that comes from placing yesterday in his hands, and the peace that comes from placing all things in his hands.
Yeah. So when you're thinking specifically of combat veterans then, and you do a lot of work, a lot of church ministry, Christian ministry among combat veterans, I'm focusing on that phrase there, the healing that comes with placing yesterday in his hands. And when you think about, discussing that phrase specifically with combat veterans, and when we're speaking of Vietnam, we're speaking of people who are either very close to retirement or who are in retirement, which means that a lot of them now are spending more time reflecting on their lives. And I think for combat veterans in Vietnam, then that means a lot of them are going to be reflecting on their time in Vietnam. When you think about just that phrase, the healing that comes with placing yesterday in God's hands, what sorts of things come up in discussions specifically with combat veterans in relation to that?
Well, healing is the child of forgiving. And I'm speaking of forgiving others, forgiving yourself. I'm going to say it past tense, when I had post-traumatic stress, I had the dreams that no doubt in these interviews you've heard about, and they're on a loop, and you have the same dream over and over, and you always hope that it ends better than it did. And of course it doesn't, because that isn't the way it ended, And I found that some of the things that had happened, that I needed to understand that Lord had forgiven me, and I needed to forgive myself. And some of the things that happened in combat are also just an invitation for the enemy of us all to come in and say, look what you did. How could you do that and be a Christian? The enemy tries to convince us that we are what we do, which is not the case. I don't find my identity in my actions. And so there was a great deal of healing that took place there when I began to learn the difference between our identity does not stem from our actions stem from our identity. So when I understood a bit about grace, I'm not sure anyone understands a great deal about grace, and won't till we get there. I understood that my identity is in Christ, not in those actions that I may have regretted or experienced.
In terms of forgiveness for others, I'm imagining when it comes to combat veterans, perhaps especially combat veterans from the Vietnam War, one of those others it might be hard to forgive would be the protesters. Not folks who were opposed to the war. I think a lot of folks look back now and see that there were, reasons perhaps not to be enthusiastic about the war or about how the war was being prosecuted. Obviously, it's a very controversial thing. I'm thinking of the protesters who I've heard about so many times. When these veterans arrive in California, these protesters are yelling at them, throwing things at them, spitting on them. This sort of thing. It didn't happen to all vets. Perhaps it didn't happen to a majority of vets, but it certainly happened to some. And I've heard from some of those.
Yeah.
When you think about combat vets, especially Vietnam vets, is this one of the areas of forgiveness that's hard, forgiving these?
Well, forgiveness, usually you have to go way back and start someplace even before the war and find out who you're holding a grudge against. That grudges are the burden we bear when we refuse to forgive someone, and regrets are the burden we bear when the person we refuse to forgive is ourselves. But I had to go way back and start with my father, who was in Patton's Third Army and who suffered from, well, we call it today post-traumatic stress. Back then, they called it, I think, battle fatigue, First World War shell shock. And I think maybe its most poignant name was in the American Civil War. It was called soldier's heart.
Mm.
And as a result of that, he was an alcoholic, and if we're setting standards, we're finding that he didn't. The standards of being a father were not something my father had, And now, understanding why now as an adult is, as a child, you can't understand why. And so if you go back and find that person, whoever it is, and so often it's the father, and forgive them, understand how to forgive them, then forgiving all these other people becomes so much easier.
Mm.
And one of the things you have to realize is when you won't forgive someone, you've judged them, and no one has the right to judge other than God. If you understand that the people that you refuse to forgive are people that you are judging, and you need the Lord's help to forgive. But first thing is, if you're not forgiving them, then you've judged them, and we don't have that right.
Well, and it sounds like part of what you're saying is that the energy that goes into maintaining a grudge, which is very easy to understand why, I'm thinking of some guy who spends 13 months up in I-Corps dealing with everything you dealt with, comes home, and now is dealing with some kid who's had a life of ease at the University of California, Berkeley, now yelling at him, throwing stuff at him. I mean, it's not hard to understand why you would hold a grudge, but it sounds like what you're saying is the grudge, the person who understandably is maintaining that grudge is paying a price.
Yes, it's a horrible burden.
Yeah.
It's a horrible burden because basically you're holding on to judgment.
Yeah. Let me pass the story by you, and I'm not asking you to solve this. I think we're, much better than I do that, these are extremely difficult things. But let me pass something by you that I've recently learned from another combat veteran. They're down in 3 Corps, down around the Tainan province area. They're out on patrol. They hear some footsteps. In that context, they have every reason to think that those footsteps are Viet Cong, and they're in an ambush position. And so they open up, and then they find out that probably not Viet Cong, it was a mom and her little child. You can run through that and say, given where we were, we had every reason to think it was Viet Cong. Nobody intended to do that to a mom and her little kid. You can run through it, but of course, that's not going to alleviate the burden of these vets. So imagine you've got that vet as part of your ministry who's come to your church. He knows there's a veteran ministry there. He relates that story to you. I know that you don't have a magic wand, but I'm just interested, what would be the beginning of a discussion that you would have with that vet?
Well, first let's go back and look at what caused that. In the company I was in, Echo 2-1, we had what's called accidental homicide with one of the guys. That's how they termed it. And he had gotten outside the line. His name was Terry, and he'd been killed by 3 of his buddies because they were scared. They heard something, they were scared. Now, they said And I was there when they said it to the captain that he forgot the password. And I knew when I heard him say it, he didn't forget the password. Fear caused this. They just shot, fear. And it would take a good deal of looking at what actually happened and why it happened. And again, we're going to have to go back to understanding that God has forgiven us and we need to forgive ourselves. That's a tough one. You go into boot camp and you receive a new identity. I was 17 years old, and by the time I was 18, I was in combat. Well, teenagers, no frontal lobes, and you get you have this new identity put into you, and you also are taught that that they're not people, that they're dehumanized, and it starts in boot camp. They're not people, they're gooks, and all types of ways to dehumanize them. It makes it easier to kill them. So one of the things happens when you become a Christian is that you realize that you shot people, not gooks. These were people, and that's one of the things that you now you can say, well, it was war. You can justify all kinds of things, but I had to go through some times myself with the Lord.
So you went into the Marine Corps, was it 1965?
Yeah.
You were 17?
Yes.
And why did you go into the Marine Corps?
We'll go back a little ways into my home life. Poor is a relative term, but we were poor. As a child, one of my jobs was to cut the ends off tin cans and nail them over to rat holes. And my mother was banned from one of the supermarkets in town because she was stealing food to feed her children. And of course, all this had to do with my father's alcoholism. Well, she died when I was 13, and so I lost my anchor, and I was shipped around to various relatives, and I did finally get back to my father's house where he had remarried. And I went in at 17 for a couple of reasons. One is I wanted out of there. The other reason I went into the Marine Corps was I believe this hype about Marines, and it's not all hype, some of it's true. I had a victim's mentality, and as a child, I really got picked on and whooped up on a lot, And so I thought, I'm going to join the Marine Corps. They'll teach me how to fight, and then no one will ever hurt me again. That was my thought. Still at 17 years old, I've been going on my whole life. I made a mistake. The Marine Corps does not teach young men how to fight, teaches them how to kill, because that's the purpose of war. I didn't really want to kill anyone. I just didn't want them to hurt me. So.
Wow. At that time, 65 is pretty early. Did the word Vietnam mean anything to you at that time in 1965?
Oh, I mean, we knew there was a war going on, but, listen, I was so naive, I was just joining the Marine Corps, and with no thought of, the next hour, the next minute never occurred to me that, they might send me to Vietnam.
So you go into the Marine Corps, but there's no sense that I might end up at this place I'm hearing about every once in a while called Vietnam.
Yeah. I tell you, when I woke up on that, my first night in Da Nang, I'm in a war zone. People could get killed here.
Yeah. So tell me about that. So you arrive in Da Nang then in 66?
66, June of 66, arrived in Da Nang, spent the first night at the airport there. The F-4s were making runs all night long, and right by the edge of the runway, they had some tents for the newbies. And the next day I was up at Dong Ah
Mhm.
on the DMZ,
Yeah.
and I spent that. I had the wire duty one night, and then I was out in the field, and we were at a forward fire base. And then night after that, I was out on an ambush. You know, go out at night on an ambush.
And
All right, so
how long had you been in country?
3 or 4 days. You know,
So it didn't
and
take long for Vietnam to become real.
oh yeah, it became real, very real, right away, and it was. And I was still clueless. It's amazing. The military gets him young because they can, the body is still supple and the mind is still malleable.
Mm.
And they
Yeah.
can form them like they want.
Wow.
And of course, there's no frontal lobes. So,
what was the first thing you experienced? You arrive in Da Nang in June '66. What's the very first thing that really, of course, you're flying into a war zone, but at some point it becomes crystal clear that you're in a war zone. It's no longer an abstraction. Now it's real. What was the very
yeah.
first thing that really drove this point home to you that this is a serious war zone?
Well, obviously, at my age, it was the first time I'd ever been out of the country, and then I go in, and this is a different country. Things are different. Things smell different. Things look different. And this is real. I am in Vietnam, and this is where people get killed. I'd do it all over again, every bit of it. If I were able, I would do it all over again.
Why do you say that?
Well, once a warrior, always a warrior. Once that is, my identity is in Christ. What you are is not who you are, but what I am as a warrior, and who I am is 2 Corinthians 5:21. I'm the righteousness of God in Christ. That's who I am. But what I am is a warrior.
So it's interesting because a few minutes ago, you said that going into the Marine Corps, you said a few things, but one of the things you said was it was a mistake. I wanted to learn to be a fighter, but they trained me to be a killer. And my interpretation of that was, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But now, by the way, I mean, there are these paradoxes all over the place when you talk about combat veterans. So paradoxes are absolutely fine with me. Life is complicated. So you said that, but then you just said, but
I would.
I
Yes,
was
I
a
would.
warrior in '66 and 67, and I'm a warrior now.
The best thing I took away from Vietnam was the relationship with the guys I went to war with, and it's the warrior's bond. And the only bond stronger than the warrior's bond is the bond with Christ.
Mm. You mentioned the warrior's bond. Now, the bond with Christ, as you say, that doesn't come until sometime after the war, right? There are.
Oh yeah, sometime after. Yeah, absolutely. No, I came home. The thing about coming home, you probably heard this before. I don't know. Traumatic. I could have shipped over. I could go home. I wanted out of there so bad. I couldn't stand leaving my buddies. It's traumatic, to say, okay, I've got to get out of here. I got to get back to the world, but all my buddies are still there fighting.
Is it traumatic?
So I feel almost like a deserter.
That's what I was going to ask. Is it traumatic partly because I mean, my understanding is one of the things that creates this really tight relationship with the guys you're with up there near the DMZ is that they know you're looking out for them and they're looking out for you. And that's the whole world right there. We're not talking grand strategy. It's me and the Marine next to me.
It comes down to that incorrect English statement, I got your back.
Yeah.
I got your six.
And so when you go, your 13-month tour is up, it's my time to go, I'm out of here. But it sounds like there is that feeling though, but that I'm also telling my buddies to whom I'm saying goodbye, I don't have your back anymore. I've got to go. Is that kind of the thing?
You're leaving your brothers. You're leaving the guys who probably the guys you'll be closest to the rest of your life. And the job's not done.
Mm.
You know, I'm sure you've heard that before.
Mm. What was the job?
Well, the job, you know, I look at the job I thought I was doing was helping people, fighting communism, which is against freedom. You know, I mean, and freedom, as far as I'm concerned, is a worship word. You know, it's for freedom's sake, he set us free.
Mm.
You know, and I have a different view of war now than I did back then. And I say I would do it all over. I would prefer to have a different reason for doing it. You know, another thing about military service and war, it is the most terrible rite of passage to manhood, but it is a rite of passage.
And it's one that you would do again.
I would, for the right reasons. Yeah.
You talk about this very tight relationship that Marines have, and it stays with them in one way or another, whether they go to reunions or not. I still think that they have a strong attachment to the Marines, the soldiers, the sailors they were with, the airmen they were with. But of course, in the world of war, sometimes our comrades don't make it. The Marine next to us doesn't make it. And so here's one of those paradoxes where there's this very tight relationship, but there's also a need. If that Marine next to me didn't make it through this firefight, there's the need to, in a sense, at least for the moment, to let that go and move on. You got to keep going. At least that's what I've heard. I don't know. I'm interested in your response to that. And I'm thinking especially, is it Thilo
Osterich.
Thilo, and I'm thinking especially in relation to him.
Well, here's the thing with Thilo. Finest young man I ever knew. When I met him, I said, "This is and I mean we're the same age, you know, but I'm the leader, and he's and he immediately I said, I love this guy, you know. He's straight, you know. There's no bull here. I like this guy, and I'm not afraid to say I loved him because I now have a better understanding, being in Christ, of love. So, as a squad leader, first fire team leader, and he was on my fire team, and then as a squad leader, and I made him leader of the fire team. I had to tell people to take point. Now, there's two schools of thought. One school of thought is, and this was prevalent, was it's only fair that everybody takes a turn walking point. That was one school of thought. The other school of thought is you put the best guy on point, the very best point man on point, because he gives the rest of the squad and everybody else the best chance of survival. Mm. You know, he knows what he's doing. So you take the guy that you love like a brother and you tell him, go out there and walk point. And that's where it comes in. Squad leader, worst job I ever had. There's nothing better for a warrior than to lead men in combat in a life and death struggle. There's nothing worse than to tell the guy you love, walk point. We had been out in the field and we came in and they said, get cleaned up, put on clean uniforms. Some of us didn't have clean uniforms, you know, I mean, we had what we were. And they brought the 6x in, the trucks, and they trucked us into Da Nang. And we got on a C-130 and we flew to Cam Ranh Bay, the whole company, you know. And then they said, turn in your ammunition. And you don't tell a bunch of Marines in a war zone to turn in their ammunition, you know.
Mm.
But some of us just turned our magazines over so they couldn't see we still have, we disobeyed the order and turned, so they couldn't see we still had a full magazine. And then they stood us out there in the tarmac in company formation. And we're standing here and stand there. And as it turned out, President Johnson was coming to Cameron Bay and he wanted some troops to review. And so they had taken our ammunition away so one of us wouldn't shoot him.
I wonder.
Yeah.
And so did President Johnson walk right by you in review? Or?
Well, he was in a truck, standing up in the back of a truck, you know, and yeah, I thought it was hilarious. The man's, and he takes off his coat and everyone applauds. And I'm like, what'd the man do? He took off his coat. You know?
So they flew you from I-Corps to Cameron Bay just for this, for the
just from Da Nang just to stay, and then of course right back to the field. In fact, they tried to send us back into the field when a lot of us had turned in our ammunition, and our skipper said, "We don't have any ammunition. You know, we're not going back in the field right now." And some of us that had no clean uniforms, they'd given us some clean uniforms, and they said, "Give them back." And they said, "You're crazy. We're not giving these back."
You were in Vietnam over Christmas.
Yes.
What do you remember about Christmas in I-Corps 1966?
I remember that we had a big operation, and there were several different battalions involved. In fact, I accidentally made some contact with some Aussies, couldn't hear them, but I mean, a lot of people, but a big operation. And we did a night insertion with the choppers, and then we walked all night, and then we got ambushed. The next morning we climbed a mountain, and this is like right at Christmas time, maybe 23rd, 24th, something like that. And so we climbed this mountain, and it's pretty high, and there were two peaks on the mountain, but it was raining, windy, cold. Now, you think of Vietnam being cold, but you know, our blood had thinned out. We were acclimated to the tropics, so we were cold and miserable. And we had this one guy who was the company clown, and everybody loved him. So he had this song that I cannot tell you because pretty bawdy, and he sang it, and he was on one of the hilltops, and we could see and hear each other, you know, and the skipper was on the other one, and so he breaks into song, and everybody's laughing, and the skipper laughs, and he picks up the radio and calls over and says, "Sing it again, that's an order." So he sang it again, you know, and I mean, it was really insulting to the officers and everyone, but and it was so, the weather was so bad, we couldn't get the choppers in. And so we were digging through where we had buried the food. We dug through there to see if we could find any more food after a few days. And in fact, you know, in Vietnam, we used to take the C4, and we'd get a little piece about the size of the end of your thumb and light that on fire and heat our coffee, you know. Well, it came time we finally got the choppers in, but they didn't have a clear LZ. So we had to take no more C4. We'd use it all to heat coffee. So we had to wrap a clay bar around a tree and blow that tree into the little toothpicks to get the place for the chopper to land, you know. And I do remember we finally got down off that mountain, and we were still pretty hungry. And the villagers came out, and we bought rice from them, and it had little black specks in it, and it was the bugs, you know. We were just eating that up there, bugs and all, you know. Also members of Christmas in Vietnam, Christmas of 66.
Did the body song have anything to do with Christmas?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, it was, yeah, I'll tell you off record.
Did it matter at all that it was Christmas? Did anybody mention that it was Christmas, or
No, no, it was
just another
you know,
day?
yeah, just another day.
When you look back on your tour in Vietnam, um, I know you must have a lot of very sharp memories, things that are still very easy to bring to your mind's eye. Um, and if I were to ask, is there any particular memory that is especially sharp? My guess would be that there'd probably be, several. But I don't know, when I
Yeah.
ask that question, is there a particular memory that is especially sharp, or if there are a few, if you could select one, is there a particularly sharp memory that has stuck with you from your 13 months in Vietnam?
Well, there are some particularly sharp memories that are unpleasant memories uh,
Mm,
of shooting people, of having people, buddies die. A guy drowned right in front of me. I mean, people were blown up, and I mean, those are sharp memories. There's also one funny memory, if I may share that. So one day, the whole company was crossing a large open field, and to the left of us was a railroad trestle, and in front of us was a fairly high embankment. So the whole company is out in the middle of the field, and we start receiving fire from the railroad trestle and the embankment. So we're in crossfire out there. We're all out there basically in the kill zone. And it just happened that these guys were, they were more farmers than anything else. The Kong were farmers at one time and fighters the next, but
yeah.
these guys were lousy shot. So they finally hit one of us. And he got the Forrest Gump wound, I'll say, right across the cheeks, so to speak.
No,
So
the bottom cheeks.
yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, yeah.
And so someone yells, "Corpsman!" We got a guy, Corpsman up. So the corpsman comes up, and the guy exposes the wounded area, so to speak, and the corpsman is patching him up. Well, just about then, Skipper says, he's thinking, I got to get the company out of this open field. We're taking fire. So he pulls out his 45 and he says, charge. And we all charge. And so I happen to look over and look at this guy, and he's charging with his trousers at half mast, holding them up with one hand. He's firing his M16 with the other hand, and he's screaming like a banshee, and the hopes of a family future are out there in the breeze. And so, and I'm about to double over laughing while charging out of an ambush. It was funny. I mean, it's like, oh, you had to be there.
One of the surreal memories of war. Wow. You just mentioned the M16. I wanted to ask you about that because you don't mention it in what I've read of your writing. But in the time you were there, 66, 67, I've heard from a number of folks who say these M16s were not a reliable weapon.
No, they weren't. We call them the Mattel. I mean, we went over with M14s. We were in combat with M14s. Great weapon, rugged. And then they take away our M14s and they gave us these M16s. And the conditions were such that, it didn't take much dirt to jam them. In fact, they had to put what they called a boat keeper in them. And no, we didn't like them at all. They were much lighter, easier to carry. But when it comes to fighting, the M14, especially for bayonet use, is much, much better.
Mm.
And I qualified with a number of weapons. I shot the M1, M14, M16. At one period of time, I carried a 12-gauge shotgun for close-in stuff.
Was there any talk among the Marines you served with, because this topic has come up in different conversations with different Marines, And in one case, the lieutenant in command allowed his Marines to use AKs that they picked up from the Viet Cong. The problem, of course, is that those have a particular sound, and if other Marines don't know, they're going to be attracted to that sound, not knowing that a Marine's using them. But his
Yep.
rationale was, look, this M16 is so unreliable, whereas the AK-47 is an absolutely superior weapon. I have to make a choice, and I'm going to allow my Marines to do that. Did that? Now I've heard other Marines who said, no way, it's true that the M16 wasn't reliable, but we're not going to use the AK because that creates a whole new set of problems. In your case, did that discussion come up? This weapon's so
Well,
unreliable, so what are we going to do?
a lot of guys use different things. We had a corpsman, he used a 45 caliber grease gun. Our skipper varied between a Thompson and a M1 carbine. One of the guys captured an AK-47 and he used it.
He did.
Yeah, he did.
And the
It's a
officer,
much better weapon, much more rugged.
yeah.
And
And the officer let him do that?
sure. May you have the hope that comes from placing tomorrow in his hands, the grace that comes from placing today in his hands, the healing that comes from placing yesterday in his hands, and the peace that comes from placing all things in his hands.